strong. Sorry, and we're also recording, just an FYI. But we have a full continuum of addiction treatment, mental health outpatient treatment, as a certified community behavioral health clinic based out of Newark. We have a number of supportive housing programs here in Newark and a wide array of community-based services, including prevention, mobile community care, our latest project. And we are just really excited to provide this during the month of June for Pride, and just equip everybody with appropriate knowledge and resources. We do have 3 panelists, so I definitely do not want to take up a lot of time with intros. I'd like to just get right into it. Some housekeeping. Everybody is going to be muted for the duration of the presentation. You will receive the slides after the presentation, as well as a survey to complete if you wish to receive continuing education credits. Once you complete your survey, we hope to have all continuing education certificates emailed to you within 30 days from today. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, but we are going to hold on the questions until all 3 panelists have shared their material. If your question is for a specific panelist, please just note their name in the beginning of your question. And again, we'll go through the chat at the end. There are no other, I don't think there's anything else, but I want to start off by introducing Sylvester, who is a clinician at Integrity House, new to Integrity House, and we are so thrilled to have him. Sylvester is a professional counselor and an approved clinical supervisor in New Jersey with over a decade in the field of mental health care. His professional focus has centered on cultural competency, acculturation, trauma-informed practices, and population health, emphasizing social determinants. Currently serving as a senior counselor for the LGBTQ+ Special Populations Program at our Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinic, Sylvester is working to improve access and visibility of the LGBTQ+ issues throughout Integrity House and as a partner within community organizations who share in this mission. Sylvester is going to be speaking with us specifically about risk factors, and I will turn this over to Sylvester as I share his slides. Are you all, Sylvester, Are you able to see my slides or your slides?
I can see the slides.
All right.
All right, thank you, Iman, and welcome everyone to our presentation. My name is Sylvester Olukin. I work for the CCBHC. At the CCBHC, there's an emphasis on integration of care and managing risk factors. So that aligns well with the work that I do. I work specifically with members of the LGBTQ community with an emphasis on people who may not be certain how they identify, and with an additional emphasis on helping people who are transgendered work through the continuum of care. Today, the way my presentation is broken down, I'm going to focus primarily on language, but not LGBTQ specific language. There is a lot of overlap, but I am introducing some clinical terminology that relates to managing risk and creating safe environments for the LGBT population. So one thing that I do want to start off with is how to have a thoughtful conversation. When I started this work and when I've done diversity work, I find that people struggle with how to engage, how to ask questions, and how to kind of be more forward thinking in how they approach diversity. We know that how someone identifies is valuable to therapeutic engagement. You may not have this information immediately, and some people may not feel comfortable disclosing it because some people just might not know, although many do. Avoiding the use of heteronormative language and not making assumptions may help you to avoid common microaggressions. So that is important. One thing to do to kind of manage this as well is to integrate choices and identity markers on your forms, on your intake forms, on your enrollment forms. So clinicians will already have the information available to them. And obviously as well, you want to give the people a chance to opt out because people might not be ready, or this might not be something that they see as a primary issue for their treatment. All right, Iman, we can go to the next slide. So to the point, one important concept is gender dysphoria. And I'm going to define it for you and just give you a little bit more information on it. Gender dysphoria is described as a psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Though gender dysphoria often begins in childhood, some people may not experience it until after puberty or much later in life. Support for people with gender dysphoria may include open-ended exploration of their feelings and experiences of gender identity and expression, without the therapist having any predefined gender identity or expression outcome defined as preferable to another. Psychological attempts to force transgendered people to be cisgendered, cisgendered meaning that your sex at birth aligns with your gender identity. Any attempts to correct this is considered unethical, and it's unethical because it causes psychological harm, and that there's a ton of evidence for that. So we can move on. So let's talk about LGBT and gay affirming therapy. The idea really emanated from the pathologizing of LGBT populations, where it was seen as a mental disorder back in prior versions of the DSM. Affirmative therapy is a type of psychotherapy used to validate and advocate for the needs of sexual and gender minority clients, right? We're teaching healthy expressions of gender and sexual identity instead of pathologizing. And this runs contrary to conversion, to attempts at conversion. This gets us to psychological health, whereas any attempts to deny and validate leads to distress. And we'll see how that feeds into negative outcomes in the community. So we can move to the next slide, please. So the process of coming out. So I'm going to talk about two distinct processes. So coming out is a process of self-acceptance. Give me 1 second. Coming out is a process of self-acceptance as being a member of the LGBT community, as well as choosing to share how you identify with those important to you and to live openly. We have to remember that acceptance is an ongoing process for many, and an act of coming out can be traumatic, not inherently, right? Coming out inevitably leads to more beneficial and positive psychological outcomes. But the associated events, right? The potential for rejection, the myriad of confusion, not knowing exactly where to fit in, who to speak to. And, a lot of people in the community, they suffer violence, unfortunately, as a result of their identity. Support, especially from family members, yields the best outcomes. And we think family, we think of a nuclear family, mom, dad, Brady Bunch. If you're younger than I am, you may not know what the Brady Bunch is, but just the nuclear typical suburban family, right? But, siblings, uncles and aunts, extended family, we all have a role to play in promoting psychological health for people who are coming out. A lot of people have chosen communities as well, networks of people who they find to be supportive. And this has been seen as very protective. One thing that I'm going to talk about soon is that coming out can facilitate a sense of belonging in a chosen community. So I do want to talk about that as well. Coming out is distinctly a unique process for people in the transgender and non-binary community. It's a process of living consistently with their gender identity. So in order to facilitate this, people, they develop a sense of who they are. They may change their name, whether it just be informally or legally, right? They may have affirming therapy, medical care, and things that kind of allow them to live their truth, right? Again, we know that it's harmful to invalidate what people are experiencing, even if it's through bullying or harassment or humor. Those things can be invalidating. I think we have to follow alongside the people that we're serving. and give them that space, that psychological safety to express themselves in a non-threatening environment. So we're going to move on. Affirming care. Gender affirming care is a supportive form of healthcare, as I'm sure Dr. Awad will touch upon. Other concepts. It consists of an array of services that may include medical, surgical, mental health, and non-medical services for transgender and non-binary people. So non-medical services might be social services, housing, and other aspects of life that people need to attend to in order to feel safe and secure and included in society. A safe and affirming healthcare environment is critical to fostering better outcomes for transgender, non-binary, and other gender expansive children and adolescents. Medical and psychosocial gender affirming healthcare practices have been demonstrated to yield lower rates of adverse mental health outcomes, build self-esteem, and improve overall quality of life for transgender and gender diverse youth. We must work again to depathologize what it means to be a part of the community, especially for the youth who may feel isolated and may feel a sense of rejection from their primary networks and community. So we can move on. I thought it was appropriate to incorporate this idea of minority stress, right? Minority stress, any stress, can lead to adverse health outcomes. We've seen this from ACE studies. We see this from when we examine the role that PTSD and other psychological health issues have on your physical health, right? Minority stress model describes stress processes related to stigma and prejudice, including experience of prejudice and discriminating events and conditions. The expectation of prejudice and discrimination, concealment of sexual orientation, and internalization of stigma. It can lead to a hypervigilance and behavioral avoidance, even if the immediate threat is no longer present. And we see that most characteristically in PTSD, but this is also characteristic of other stress responses. Stress over time complicates efforts towards healthy coping and increases physical and mental health risk factors. So we can move on to the next slide. One important concept generally in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we're speaking about a specialized population here, is a sense of belonging. A sense of belonging in all settings and in all places. And this helps to also foster safe spaces. So belonging is a subjective feeling of acceptance in a social system, often distinguished from inclusion, because belonging assumes sharing parts of yourself with a group without compromising your identity and without the pressure towards ultimate conformity. So we can move on. So talking about psychological safety, this is the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. In collectives of people, it refers to members believing that they can take risk without being shamed by other members, right? So in order for us to be safe, we need to promote inclusion. A lot of modalities psychotherapeutically might include psychotherapeutic groups, didactic groups, or psychoeducational groups. If people don't feel safe to share, they will continue to be marginalized and isolated. And we want to avoid that at all costs. All right, so next slide. So the main thing I want to talk about, the primary focus is suicide risk. And this is primarily because of the adverse outcomes that we see in this society and the disparities that we see. So we can go to the next slide. I wanted to give you the research and the numbers, because the numbers, they tell a very grim story. Research suggests that the LGBT community faces health disparities linked to social stigma, discrimination, and civil and human rights denial. Discrimination against LGBT persons has been associated with high rates of psychiatric disorder, substance use, and suicide. So just to remind you again, it's because of the way society continues to interact with the LGBT community. It's not because of how they identify, it's because of societal reactions that cause these adverse outcomes. 48% of transgender adults report that they have considered suicide in the last year, compared to 4% of the overall US population. For transgender youth, affirming can reduce suicidal thinking by 73%, right? So affirming means family inclusion, finding communities that affirm, and also across the board, finding people who are peers, right? Who've made it through the process, who have a sense of confidence in their identity and can help to shepherd people through. That's important as well. Suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst young people aged 10 to 24. And lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and or questioning youth are at significantly higher risk. The Trevor Project found that 45% of LGBT youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. The intersection of identities may in turn present distinct stressors for some LGBT youth compared to others, and minority stress may be most persistent and problematic for youth who occupy multiple marginalized social positions. So think about the intersection between socioeconomics and LGBTQ inclusion, race, geography. People who live in rural areas struggle more with access than people who live in the city. Those are certain intersecting identities that can complicate people's realities. All right. So I have more. Okay. 1 second.
Sorry, did you want me to move past this one or?
You can move past that one. So talking about suicide risk, signs, and protective factors. One thing to note is that people commit suicide due to a convergence of stressors that create feelings of hopelessness and despair. Some risk factors include a change in environment, displacement. We can also see a discharge from a psychiatric facility or a treatment provider. When treatment providers tend to be non-affirming, people may leave treatment and may lose hope in treatment, right? So that's why it's important to be affirming. In a discharge from a psychiatric hospital, we've seen to increase risk amongst the general population. So those risks are also there for people in the LGBTQ community. A history of suicide attempt is predictive of ongoing risk as well as a family history. Can also suggest that there are certain predispositions present. We also want to see family beyond the typical conception of family. So we have to always remember that. Discrimination, family rejection, isolation, low self-esteem, bullying, laws and policy, depression, and hopelessness. And I added laws and policy in there, maybe for obvious reasons, but the constantly shifting landscape of what's acceptable, what's endorsed, what's validated, and what's not, it does weigh heavily on our collective consciousness. And it may deprive people of that sense of hope. Stigma and negative attitudes can seep into the self-image of an LGBTQ individual and create a sense of internalized homophobia, a state that has been linked to suicidal ideation. So internalized homophobia, even if somebody is openly gay or lesbian, bisexual, transgender, they may still experience internalized homophobia, which any type of internalized stigma, some people consider it self-hate, right? So that complicates your ability to move through things authentically and genuinely. And it's a form of self-invalidation. Parental rejection, as mentioned before, it does increase suicide risk and it increases it by almost 8 times. We've spoken about conversion therapy, and it does promote psychological harm, and people who have experienced it have an increased risk of suicidal ideation and attempts as well. We know with suicide that thinking becomes limited, and this feeds into those feelings of despair and hopelessness. When thinking becomes limited, we want to create space and time for people to move through distressing thoughts and feelings. And we don't want them to be alone, right? So having that patchwork, that network to kind of formulate a safety system for people is protective, absolutely. In any system of care, we want to universalize screening, right? Not just for the LGBT population, but for everyone. There should be consideration for understanding people's risk factors and where they are with their thinking about suicide. So this will capture people who aren't necessarily open, who have not come out yet, but we'll be able to identify those risk factors. One way to manage suicide risk factors is to help people counter the feelings of isolation and to identify viable support networks. Referrals can be made to affirming places of worship, community centers, and support groups. Many of these are also offered online for people who may live in rural areas, who may lack access to transportation, and it may be a good first step for some. At the highest level of risk, people and their supporters should be aware of their options. Precautions should be taken, and admission to an appropriate facility may be warranted. We also want to limit means when it comes to access to weapons and anything that can be lethal. That's also important to helping to manage suicide risk. So just to sum it up, we're understanding risk and protective factors. Are risk factors anything that could further feed into the feeling of despair and hopelessness? Protective factors are factors that might help someone to see through their current level of distress. Things to hold on to, things that might engender a sense of hope. We want to facilitate emotional awareness and regulation. We want to restructure minority stress cognitions. This may best be accomplished through cognitive behavioral techniques, rational emotive behavioral techniques, and other skill building techniques to help people kind of shift the way they think, possibly replace irrational thoughts with more rational ones, not to invalidate what they're thinking and feeling, but just to help them see it through. We want to empower assertive communication. This is important for self-advocacy and getting your needs met in the community. We want to validate the unique strengths of the LGBT community and to give people a sense that their identity isn't associated with entirely with stigma, right, which is false. But there are positive and empowering aspects of being a part of this community. Again, we're affirming healthy modes of expression. One thing that I really wanted to touch upon, and after this we can move to the next slide, is understanding the experience of disenfranchised grief. So grief is socially sanctioned for us, for the heteronormative community. We grieve our partners, we grieve friends. Grief has been normalized as a process of going through an emotional state due to a loss of someone close to us. For members of marginalized communities who may have constructed a community for themselves, they may lose someone that you may not realize is close to them. Even pets might provide people with a deep sense of comfort, and that loss too might be grieved. You might be grieving the loss of your primary social network, your family, even though they're still alive. Losing people or losing the relationship that you've had with people can cause a lot of psychological distress. So kind of looking for those things might be important, definitely is important when helping people to manage their risk. So Aman, are there any questions in the chat yet?
Not at this time.
Okay. All right, so I'll move on. So I want to talk next about substance use, and I'm going to go over the stats. People who identify as gay or lesbian are more than twice as likely as those who identify as heterosexual to have a severe substance use disorder. People who identify as bisexual are 3 times as likely to have a substance use disorder. And we see this possibly because there's pressure from the heterosexual community and the LGBT community. There's also stigma and a sense of rejection. So we see that heightened risk factor amongst bisexual, primarily men, but women as well. Those who are unsure of how they identify are 5 times as likely to have a substance use disorder compared to heterosexual people, right? Transgender people, including non-binary people, also have high rates of addiction and substance use. For many trans people, substance use starts at a very young age compared to the general population. So next slide, please. You can go to the next one. Okay, some best practices. Some common SUD, substance use disorder treatment modalities have been shown to be effective for gay or bisexual men, including motivational interviewing, social support therapy, and just a point for social support therapy that helps to improve interpersonal effectiveness, because we know that having a sense of community, being able to maintain positive relationships is supportive and it's protective. Contingency management, which offers alternatives to stimulant use, and cognitive behavioral therapy. We want to ensure that you're working through comorbid medical and psychiatric conditions. Integrating care always yields best outcomes. So when people use substances, they become susceptible not only to infectious diseases, but they may neglect other medical health issues. So when treating any disorder, you don't want to compete with another one. You want to kind of attend to multiple diseases or disorders that a person's experiencing. I wanted to make a point of meeting people where they're at. This comes from person-centered therapy, and this also is a major component of motivational interviewing. Sometimes when we have ideas and thoughts and our own plan for people's recovery, it can be very invalidating. If we continue to be invalidating, this will further compound the experience that people in marginalized communities have. So we want to follow along with them in terms of where they're at. We want to prioritize their needs. Some people are not ready to change, and we have to work with them within the appropriate stage. And I can talk for days about motivational interviewing, but we definitely don't have time. Going to go on. We know that harm reduction is often protective, and it's also a major component of treatment when it comes to mental health conditions and comorbid substance use disorders. And MAT treatment too helps people to manage their cravings and urges. And it could be a very important adjunct to psychotherapy and substance abuse treatment. So mental health, we have an infographic here. The reality, and this is more psychosocial than intrapsychic. The reality for adults is that personal, family, and social acceptance of sexual orientation and gender identity affects the mental health and personal safety of LGBTQ+ individuals. A majority of LGBTQ people say that they or an LGBT friend or family member have been threatened or non-sexually harassed and sexually harassed or experienced violence, 51%, because of how they identify. 59% feel that they've had fewer opportunities because of how they identify. And more than half of all respondents in a survey have reported that they have faced cases of providers denying care, using harsh language, or blaming the patient's sexual orientation or gender identity as a cause of their illness. So we'll move on to teenagers. Okay, so teenagers, we see a higher risk, six times more likely to experience symptoms of depression than non-LGBT teens. 29% of transgender youth have been threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. And we also see a high incidence of bullying that can, complicate mental health in teenagers. For practitioners, and this is the last slide, current research suggests that treatment should address unique factors in the patient's lives. These may include homophobia, transphobia, family problems. One important aspect of treatment might be offering groups to family members, offering supportive counseling to family members, and not just the identified client. inviting family into sessions to help them understand the experience of their loved one. Intimate partner violence is something that is complicated as well, especially when people are afraid to speak up due to fear of being further stigmatized and rejected, and social isolation. So that's something to consider. Due to the high incidence of violence towards members of the LGBT community, excuse me, we have to ensure that we are being trauma informed. Experiences such as coming out and chronic minority stress can lead to further healthcare complications, and it may detract from psychological and emotional health. Community engagement is critical, especially amongst organizations and institutions that may not be well versed in managing risk factors. So we do have the task to help the community understand the risk factors, sort of providing a public health service, and then ensuring that the resources are aware. So the last piece of this is talking about environmental modifications or creating safe spaces. And this can be done virtually, and this can be done in person, right? So creating a safe space is having up-to-date postings, literature, and information and resources that are reflective of the needs of the population. You want to make this space affirming, in a sense that there are visible markers, whether it be the pride flag, whether it be the transgender pride flag, showing that this is a safe space, right? But we don't stop there at visibility. There definitely needs to be ongoing training, because we want staff to lean in. We want all staff to lean in and to ensure that in any space, in any program element, in any facility, that people know who to go to seek support and care. So I'm going to leave it there because it is 12:33. But thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, it'll be the last part of our presentation.
Thank you, Sylvester. I just want to make a note before we move on that our participants and our audience has increased a lot since we started. So I'm going to ask the participants if they can just drop their name and what organization you're from, and if you want to share your contact information for us to keep in touch with you. That would be really helpful just to know what sort of an audience we were able to capture in today's presentation. So as Sylvester mentioned, Integrity, we're very proud to be a safe place and be an ally with the LGBTQ population. But I want to move on to our community partners who are, Kevin Taylor is going to talk to us about community resources. And so Kevin is a senior pastor of Unity Fellowship Church in Newark since 2012. And Unity Fellowship Church in New Brunswick for 12 years prior to that, leading an affirming ministry that welcomes all. Kevin is a noted author. He's been a writer and a producer for television, and he has his own video production company. Kevin has written several magazines and other literary collections and has authored 10 novels and empowerment books himself. Kevin is now the director of LGBTQ services at NJCRI in Newark, and 2022 brought the release of 2 new empowerment titles that I'm sure Kevin will touch on, both in support of his continuous quest to guide people in living their greatest lives. This coming year, he will release Mama Please, his latest novel. So Kevin, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Iman, and good afternoon, everybody. Happy Pride. This is a wonderful conversation to be having with Integrity House. As a longtime Newark resident, I always see the work that you do right there on Lincoln Park, and so I'm glad to be in this virtual building with you. NJCRI was founded in 1988. This is actually our 35th anniversary, and was originally founded as the New Jersey AIDS Alliance in 1988, as you can imagine. It was the central focus in healthcare in the community, especially in the LGBT community, especially in the gay male community. It was the preeminent health concern that we were engaged with. Imagine being coming into the new millennium and coming into a new sense of being and giving birth to a generation of young people who had only heard about their community in the HIV and AIDS context, who were mindful of harm reduction and dealing with risk factors, but also searching for community, because what was imperative in building out our programming beyond the research and beyond the clinical and the medical was how we engage community. And 20 years ago, we gave birth to Project WOW. Project WOW is Web Outreach Works. So it proved to be the first place to engage young people, because at the time, many of them, couldn't go into clubs, were looking for community, and were just trying to find their way. So Project WOW has empowerment groups. They have direct one-on-one counseling with Clear Counseling, substance abuse counselors. They do the social stuff. So imagine a youth LGBT community center where almost every kind of service is provided, from life skills. Now in the space that we have downtown, we're your neighbors on Commerce Street at 45 Commerce. At the time, we were looking at the idea of the full healthcare of young people. So they can come here now and do laundry, they can come here and get hot meals, they can come here and take a shower, but they also come here to build community. Just yesterday, in observance of National HIV Testing Day, we did a game night, just because we've now started to see young people from high school as they're just coming out of school. We've gathered another level of community with young people from Rutgers and Essex County College, who are building this young adult faction. One of the most popular components programmatically that we have is Vogue Boot Camp, because, from Paris is Burning to Pose, the community of young people has seen not just the show Legendary on HBO, not just the exuberance of themselves in that culture, but also the expression of community and family in the ballroom. So it is probably our most popular night, it being Wednesday tonight. About 5 o'clock, there'll be 40, 50 kids and adults, because everyone is welcome. And while doing so, our tester is here. While doing so, immediately before, there are often breakout groups where they talk about healthy sexual behavior, about risk factors, about harm reduction. People can get tested. There are condom distribution. And yes, we're still having condom conversations in 2023, because we have to remind young people and a lot of adults that PrEP dealt with HIV. It did not deal with STIs. And so, as you can imagine, in the pandemic and in the epidemic that we have with monkeypox, people were reminded that condoms are still essential. We saw, because for whatever reason, a number of clinics in the area, especially, and even in New York, where we're getting like 40 and 50 of the monkeypox vaccines at a time, when we got 400. So we saw lines down the street and around the corner of guys from Southern Jersey, from Philly, from New York, which shocked us. But, because we were dealing with something that had such visceral and such visual repercussions, we understood that. But back to Project WOW, this space now gives sanctuary to young people, and it as the organization, as that program celebrates its 20 years, we've even seen young people who have transitioned into leadership to be able to show the youth community what it looks like to be able to grow up in community. Somebody who started here, even MJ Rodriguez, Michaela J. from Pose, who is Blanca, started as one of our young people in Project WOW. So she's come back to do the flag raising in Newark and to be part of community. And those young people who are journeying get to see some sense of who they are and how their lives can move as they walk in, as they walk in their authentic selves. But they also have some older adults who work here and at the Pride Center, so that there even are mentorship opportunities that happen for young people. Let's move to to the Pride Center, because if Project WOW's theme is come offline, right? Because we dealt with a young people population who at the beginning were hiding in what were chat rooms in 2003. They weren't as engaged, they weren't as direct. Now, as we find ourselves 20 years later, all of the young people seem to be engaging each other to arrive at a space. And so now having the space allows them to use social media to send out the flyers, to meet here for boot camp, to meet here for movie night, to meet here for karaoke nights, and to just be here collectively. Because as Sylvester was saying before, as much as all of us love social media, as much as we love the idea, because people get on our nerves sometimes that we can do this and be away. The pandemic showed us that Barbara Streisand was right. people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. And we realized in the pandemic that we need each other. We need each other to survive. We need each other to breathe and to thrive. And so as we came out of the pandemic in 21, we saw a new onslaught of young people coming offline and coming into actual space. And that takes us down the street to our adult Pride Center, the Pride Center on Academy Street. So we're both downtown and near you at 17 Academy is the Pride Center, which is located in the old Mocha Lounge, which is located in the old Euphoria. It's right between Broad and Halsey. And if the young people's edict was come offline, the adult population's edict is come back out, right? And it's not the idea of having to come out in orientation because many of them are adults living thriving and robust lives. It's the idea that with their own homes and with their own jobs and their own resources, that sometimes people can isolate, and to be able to get people back out to make sure that people are staying active in care, to make sure that people are staying active in community, to make sure that the people who may or may not be clubbers, may not go out to those kinds of events had somewhere to be. So the Pride Center has all of those resources, the empowerment groups. We do a block party that was a huge success last year during Newark Pride, but we also do kind of adult programs, so art exhibits and a Sunday book banner where we brought in authors from around the country who speak on LGBT themes to gather collectively. We had a porn star by the name of Venom who had us so packed in there that we had overflow. But the beautiful part of it is that he's also an HIV healthcare worker. So the conversation was so robust because people got to ask really, feet on the street questions about sex and sexuality and condoms and stuff that you just didn't think would be the topic when his book had this titillating cover and he's got this erotic career. But it was just really robust because harm reduction, brings all these adults out, but our mobile units are also posted outside to do every kind of testing and vaccination. And even our research team comes to make sure that we're engaging members of the community who sometimes get lost in that stringent kind of 13 to 24, 13 to 34, that HIV kind of made us feel like we care about these people, but, and realizing as we arrive into, in deeper and deeper, coming out of the pandemic, we're realizing that we have to deal with populations that we hadn't seen before, right? As we are 40 years, outside of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, we realized that there are some people who never imagined arriving at 50. There are some young people who have only lived in a lifetime where they have only known HIV, much to the point that they think they can be sick of it, but we have to keep them fully engaged and invested in their own healthcare, right? And so we found a great sense of just revived energy from the adult population as we build out the Pride Center. And it's got everything from the Pride Cafe in the morning, where some people who work at Panasonic or Prudential or Audible stop there and just get coffee to breathe before they go to work. We have decompression groups where 2 to 3 people are just kind of in meditation. All the ways that we can check in and check on each other as we remind each other that we need community. Come on back out. We still need each other. Come back out, and the resources are here for you. And so as we'll come back to the center where I am now, where my office is, the WOW Community Center, for one of our 2 newest programs, which is Project T. T is Trans Empowerment in Action. And one of the reasons when we were dealing with the CDC on this new project is before now, in this kind of revolutionary program that we're doing, trans women were kind of tossed into the HIV conversation biologically and genetically, i.e. the CDC said, well, it's still men biologically, so we'll test them that way. And we're like, that is the most assaulting and insulting perspective to have as it relates to healthcare, because if you can't honor the person coming into the door, they're not gonna come into the door. And so we worked for years to be able to break off and do this program that does all of the healthcare elements from testing and counseling, but it also has elements like, as Sylvester was talking about, supporting people with name changing. And we've got lawyers and we've got access to the courts to be able to walk people in and out of name changes with a sense of community and support that, somebody came in last week who had been trying to change their name for a year, and we helped them change it in a day. because we were invested in the conversation and invested and supported them, and they had thankfully had all the paperwork in place. But you know, in the recent conversations we've been having as it relates to fentanyl and some of the overdose stuff, you know, one of the things that Project T was able to do was to call an emergency head of household meeting with the ballroom community. And after year, we gave out what we call the real tea bags, and in them were fentanyl strips, in them were Narcan, with 2 canisters of Narcan and condoms. And we brought our clinical teams here to walk them through training, so that now these bags sit at ballroom and community events. So in the case that anything happens, there isn't the case of, as we've seen before in some things in the community, where something happened with somebody, and because they didn't know what to do, they ran in panic and left them, right? So now, you know, we've got the capacity to test what it is, whatever it is you're doing, to make sure it's fine, to be able to know what to do if somebody gets in trouble, and to break off and break away that fear that makes it seem like, uh-oh, what I did was my fault, and therefore nothing that anybody does should cost them their lives. And so the conversations have been ongoing. They've been frank. They've been robust. You know, we also WOW and Project T honored the 20-year anniversary of the murder of Sakia Gunn, a young woman here in the city of Newark who was killed in 2003 when she and her girlfriend and best friend were coming back from New York. And a gentleman accosted them right at the corner of Broad and Market, trying to get at the girlfriend. And she's like, no, thank you. We don't get down like that. We don't identify that way. And she was murdered. So in honoring that, we have partnered with the city, partnered with the county, which has a division of LGBTQIA plus affairs, to look at how we're going to honor her name, honor the spot where she was murdered, honor the city that has a Newark pride because of the life of Sakia Gunn, this young woman that I'm almost sure in my lifetime and experience, because she was almost seen as a young boy at 15, that I'm very sure that in her identity now, that there might have been some they or some he on Sakia by now. And so it's just been great to be a part of this robust conversation in the community. One of the programs, our newest that we've given birth to, sans beyond the pandemic, forgive me, is the Rainbow Project. And Rainbow is resources and awareness of intimate partner violence, nurturing and building on wellness. Rainbow. I know it's a lot, but it looks pretty when it's lined up. Because domestic, as you can imagine, domestic partnership and intimate partner violence went through the roof in the pandemic, because people were, in many cases, trapped in the house with their abuser. And so we've got keychains and barcodes all over the city where people can just walk by, and not QR codes, forgive me, that's how old I am. A QR code, and then it captures the phone number, it captures immediate resources. And so we've been able to help a number of families, so much so that we've expanded our outreach beyond the LGBT community, and made sure that the resources are available everywhere, because we want people to come offline in the youth community, to come back out in the adult community, to come forward in the trans and non-binary community, and then come through in the rainbow community, whatever it is they're going through as it relates to intimate partner and domestic violence. We want to make sure that we are helping to bring them through it and help them to move forward. And as Imam introduced, and as you see in the flyer where I'm wearing collar, I'm also pastor of an affirming church here in Newark. And one of the things that I made it essential to be a part of this conversation as it relates to my job is because now the community center is the location of the church, that we have partnered in that, because we have found in our harm reduction conversations that a number of communities across the spectrum, but especially in BIPOC communities, a lot of that parent and family conflict with the person in the LGBTQIA plus experience has to do with their religious background. And so when they can sit with, as I did this earlier today, I sat with a pastor who was struggling with some of the things that that we do here, because he has seen young people he has mentored. So he was there from birth to now, and believed that he shaped everything that they are, and they still came forward as gay. And so he's like, how do I? Because that he doesn't get to other them. They are his sons. They are people he knows in his blood family. So to be able to serve in this seat as the director of LGBTQ services, and from a seat of faith, we have during the marriage equality conversation, a number of the conservative leaning politicians wanted one-on-one conversations because they really were just trying to unpack this strict stuff from scripture, this strict stuff from their upbringing that they thought they were so clear about until, I was called to testify and shook some stuff because, God made me and God can see me in the light. And so I tell people when somebody asks me, how are you so okay being a man of faith and being out in the ways that you are in community, I say this as I leave you. God keeps on doing great things for me and God knows it's me, right? And so to know that and to walk in that, and my young people to see those gold and platinum records up there from my BET career, and wait, is that Tina Turner? Yep. It just gives them something to aspire to, and my team, to have had one of my team members come into my office when we first moved here, because we've just been in this space since February, and I put the pictures up. She said, Mr. Kevin, why are you here? Like, you could be so many other places. Why are you here for us? Because you're my children and my grandchildren. And the fact that I've lived long enough in all these pandemics, because somebody said when I was on a talk show in 2021, they said, well, so this is the first pandemic we've come through in our lifetime. And I was like, well, as a Black gay man, I've gone through AIDS in the gay community and crack in the Black community. So I've stretched my muscles already with pandemic. Let's go. So that is why this risk factor work is so imperative. If we could just do the work of getting past all of our stuffs, all of our, what it means to have the rainbow, what it means if he's got on a dress, if she's got really short hair, and just see people and call them by their name. I struggle often with the pandemic. I mean, with the pandemic, with the push from people and their pronouns, because I want to know your name, and if I know your name, I'm going to call you by your name, Sylvester. I'm going to call you by your name, Christopher. I'm going to call you by your name, Allison, because we've met. And if we do that, that I have found to be the most engaging thing of all, to help people, Joel, to help people, Jarrell, to help people, Carla, feel seen. It's like, I said, my name is Jackie. Just call me Jackie. You don't have to worry about how I became Jackie. Just like you have a friend who gets married on Friday, who leaves work on Friday as Miss Johnson and comes back 2 weeks later as Mrs. Washington because she got married. Honor Mrs. Washington, honor your mom. If you honor me by calling me by my name, that levels the playing field to a space that I feel seen, I feel heard. And I may talk to you about some stuff that I haven't talked about with anybody in my life just because you saw me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. We really appreciate that. And if you have any resources regarding these different projects and initiatives, please send them to Kara and we will include those resources in the email that we send to the audience here with the slides. Thank you again for being available. Lastly, I want to introduce Dr. Christopher Awad, who is a partner of ours as the medical director for LGBTQ+ Health and Wellness Center at Bergen-Newbridge Medical Center. Dr. Awad is a DO, who's a family medicine doctor and a medical director for the LGBTQ+ Health and Wellness Center at Bergen-Newbridge Medical Center. Sorry for the repeat. He received his medical degree from Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine in 2013 and completed his family medicine residency training at Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell Health, where he served as the chief resident. Dr. Awad specializes in comprehensive care for the LGBTQ+ community, including gender-affirming care, HIV prevention, sexual health, and primary care. Through his work in medical education and community outreach, he advocates for equitable access to high-quality, patient-centered care and the maintenance of overall health and wellness. I will share Dr. Awad's slides and pass it off to Dr. Awad.
Thank you so much for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm super excited to be here today to chat with you a little bit about some of the health struggles that we encounter within the LGBTQ community, and what we can really do as care providers to try and alleviate some of those disparities. So take a second, wait for this to get up.
Are you able to see the slides, Dr. Awad?
Yep, I can see them. Awesome, thank you. So, you know, I'm a family medicine physician by training. So my background is I was working in some capacity with the LGBTQ community for the past 7 years now. And then back in the beginning of April, I had the wonderful opportunity to come here to Bergen Newbridge and really build this LGBTQ health and wellness center. So, you know, first and foremost, we're a primary care center, really looking to try and bring all the services that patients in the community might need, any unique needs under one roof, and really try to bring all those services together in the same place to engage people in care most effectively. Next slide. So just briefly, I'd like to go through some of the objectives. I'm hoping to cover some decent amount of ground, but I'll try to be quick so we have time to have some discussion afterwards. But hoping we can gain some familiarity with some common health and healthcare disparities that disproportionately affect this population. Identify some of the prevalent risk and the appropriate preventative measures for LGBTQ individuals, and then develop some knowledge of the most common barriers to receiving gender-affirming medical interventions, and then talk a little bit about HIV pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis. Next slide. So, you know, a question I get quite often is why do we need an LGBTQ health and wellness center? Why did Bergen Newbridge decide to do this? And, you know, last year we had a community health needs assessment. So this was a survey that was given to individuals within our service area, as well as some community leaders, community partners. And, you know, you can see the statistics here. I won't read them all to you, but, you know, 66% of LGBTQ individuals that were interviewed reported experiencing some difficulties or delays in some kind of, in receiving some type of medical care that they needed. You know, not for nothing, this is in Bergen County, which is one of the more affluent areas of New Jersey. So we know that these disparities exist and that they are very profound, both here and throughout the state to varying degrees. Next slide. So this is from the Healthy People 2020 publication. So this is essentially the federal government's plan to address healthcare disparities by 2020. I can tell you for sure that all these disparities still exist. They are well and alive and thriving. So we still have lots of work to do, but you can see here a very extensive list of things that affect this community. Next slide. So just some of the bigger barriers to within healthcare. So we're, you know, starting from a position of distrust of the medical community, very warranted distrust of the medical community. You know, after the AIDS crisis, government inaction, pathologizing of people, you know, homosexuality was in the DSM as a diagnosis until 73. And we've had some other variations of different types of homosexuality. And, you know, if you're upset about being homosexual, then that's still a diagnosis, but homosexuality itself is not a diagnosis. So just really gotten to the point where things like that are gone away, but those struggles still exist, specifically in the transgender community, where we do see a lot of pathologizing requirements for specific diagnosis, right? And so instead of looking at this as an identity, we're looking at it as a diagnosis and requiring that to access services that patients need. You know, lots of stigma across the board, a big reason for people not to seek care out of fear of you know, people's perception of them, how they will be received. Discrimination, obviously, this is a huge issue. You know, the medical community is far from, you know, free of discrimination when it comes to LGBTQ patients specifically, but also larger, you know, groups of patients. We have a real shortage of competent providers. I finished medical school about 10 years ago, and I can tell you that I had 45 minutes of training that really targeted LGBTQ patients. And I think that is pretty awful. You know, we see some changes now, but unfortunately, most of those changes are driven actually by students of medicine who are looking for that type of training, requesting it from their leaders in their schools. And unfortunately, there's just not faculty to actually teach it at this point. There's limited numbers of faculty. So hopefully the, you know, students will become the teachers as time goes on, and the access to that type of education will become much more prevalent as time goes on. Financial constraints, of course, you know, access to insurance coverage. Some of these interventions that I'm going to talk about can be quite pricey. And so really finding the financial access to those opportunities for health and wellness are quite difficult. And then along that line as well, navigation issues. As a physician who also is a patient from time to time, it's impossible. It's so hard to get things done, to know who to call, to get things approved. I work in the system all day, every day, trying to get things done. And even when it's time for me to deal with my own insurance company, it's quite the headache. So I know that these are struggles that patients deal with every single day. Just to review some statistics on LGBTQ patient experience, I'll hit a few of these. I won't go over all of them. 56% of LGBTQ individuals have confronted discrimination while seeking medical treatment. We know that when someone has experienced discrimination in healthcare, they're 3 times more likely to postpone care within that year. So we're missing out on opportunities to intervene and promote health because of the experiences that people have had. So back to that comment about the medical education system. So, this survey is a little bit dated, but there's not newer data, unfortunately, to my knowledge. But they did a survey of medical students, first-year medical students, and 80% of them voiced that they had there was some implicit bias when they did implicit bias testing. So these are our unconscious thoughts, our knee-jerk reactions to individuals. So 80% of them had implicit bias. And then the more alarming part to me is the 50% expressed explicit bias. So half of those doctors in training said outright, I have issues with taking care of LGBTQ individuals. I have concerns, I have misgivings. That's a huge problem, and it's a lack of knowledge. There's a lot of ignorance there, and that's our job now for those of us who are medical educators to really train people differently, to help them know better and to help them do better. And then another really concerning one, 19% of trans or gender nonconforming people had been outright refused care because they were transgender or gender nonconforming. First, do no harm. That is the oath that we take. And we still, to this day, have people who are refusing to take care of people blatantly and proudly saying, I don't know anything about that. I don't understand that type of care. You're going to have to find somebody that does. So obviously a huge problem. Next slide. So just another survey. This is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. So a few experiences of LGBT versus non-LGBT individuals. Healthcare provider didn't believe you were telling the truth. 16% of LGBT folks experienced that, whereas only 50% of that, or 8% of the others experienced that. Healthcare provider assumed something about you without asking, 21% in the LGBTQ community and 11% only in the non-LGBTQ community. And then healthcare provider dismissed your concerns, 29% of people versus 16% of non-LGBT people. So, having your concerns dismissed, that's a surefire way to make you not want to continue engaging with that healthcare provider. Next slide. Routine screening disparities. So we know that, in primary care, prevention is key. If we want to maintain a healthy society, we really do need to be screening for things that could affect them, specifically cancer screening. So looking at Pap smear rates, 60% of non-LGBT folks that were getting the screening versus 54% of LGBT folks. And the mammograms, only 35% receiving them as opposed to 64% in non-LGBT communities. Just want to point out those two. Moving forward. So I want to dig down a little bit on some of the specific disparities, health disparities, as opposed to the healthcare system disparities. So with substance use disorders, historically many of the safe spaces for LGBT community have really been based in bars or nightclubs. They were some of the only places where LGBT folks could go to really feel comfortable and safe and live fully out loud. And we also have a struggle with a lack of LGBTQ specific sober spaces along those lines. There are not many places where people who are in recovery and also LGBTQ identifying can really go for activities. So those safe spaces that Kevin was mentioned before are super critical for the population. The community's been historically heavily very targeted by alcohol and tobacco industry ads. You can see some of the examples here surrounding the words. And then, we see a lot of self-medication for anxiety, depression, and gender dysphoria when people aren't able to access the mental health care or the gender affirming care that they really need. And then, with support group spaces or specifically in mental health settings, non-LGBT focused or specific groups can be an uncomfortable space for an LGBT identifying individual. So there is a little bit of hesitance to engage in those settings. Next slide. We see a lot of issues with body image and eating disorders that these disproportionately affect the LGBTQ community. Some of the factors that can play a role in that is fear of or experience of rejection from our peers, internalized negative messages because of sexual orientation or non-normative gender expression. So, ideas about what a man is supposed to look like, what a woman is supposed to look like, and then some of the unfortunate actions that patients take to try and change their bodies to sort of fit into one specific mold. Experience of violence or post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that this is a huge risk factor for eating disorders. And then, an inability to meet body image ideals within some certain contexts is another risk factor. So specifically with gender affirming care, one of the areas that is the most wrought with disparities, it's oftentimes very difficult for transgender and non-binary folks to really access the interventions that are going to help them alleviate the distress caused by their gender dysphoria. There's a current system in place in many places where you need lots of approvals or you need clearance, you need someone to sign off before you can have hormone therapy and that type of thing, and then proof of medical necessity. So on the clearance front, some of the things we can do are, looking at informed consent models instead of a mental health clearance model, and, targeting individuals who need mental health wraparound services and encouraging them to seek those out, but not delaying life-saving interventions like hormone therapy in the majority of cases. To wait for someone to sort of sign off and approve this, the idea that someone has to prove that they're trans enough or make sure so that we can protect them. It's a very paternalistic idea in many cases, and so we have to be aware of that for sure. Interventions can be costly and oftentimes not covered by medical benefits. Access to mental health providers who are competent, who are LGBTQ competent, is limited to begin with, and then finding a competent therapist or psychiatrist who accepts insurance is another layer that makes it even more difficult. And then also insurance policies, the company's policies often lag behind the professional organization recommendations. We can see that now with surgical clearances, surgical approvals requiring more letters than is recommended by like the WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. So those guidelines can definitely lag behind, and that is a huge challenge for patients, despite informing them that this is not, this is not based on guidelines, this is not evidence-based practice, what you're requesting of this patient. These delays can be incredibly frustrating for individuals, and oftentimes lead to self-medication with unprescribed, unmonitored hormones or silicone injections, off the street. And we know that there are a ton of health risks there. These interventions, hormone therapy is very safe when monitored and prescribed, but when not monitored, dosing, can be way too much, or not the right type of medication. And we see things like blood clots, strokes, heart attacks, infections from the injections. And these things can be really life-altering. They can be disfiguring or cause chronic pain in the case of the silicone injections. Next slide. Some of the sexual health disparities, we do a lot of work with this here. Many medical providers, most medical providers, in fact, I would say, are uncomfortable taking a really thorough sexual history. It's not something that they're typically trained well in. And, this is really exacerbated when the patient's sexual practices might differ from that of the provider. Their frame of reference is just not there. So, a lot of times we see inappropriate STI testing, or it's just not done at all because of lack of training and lack of understanding of a patient's specific risk factors, right? So doing things like triple site testing, so checking oral swabs, urine or cervical swabs, and anal swab based on patient sexual practices is not as commonplace as it really should be. So it is important to make sure that, clients or patients are connected with providers who are competent in that regard. HIV pre and post exposure prophylaxis, these are not as not as always discussed as frequently as they should be with patients, or prescribed even when patients request them. A lot of primary care doctors, really this should be living in primary care, are uncomfortable with prescribing these interventions, and oftentimes refer to specialists, and increase the amount of time that patients are waiting for interventions, and just make it harder for them to really get this critical care that they should be getting. And then within the PrEP world, we see a lot of racial and socioeconomic uptake differences. So communities of color that are currently have a disproportionate share of new cases, or account for a disproportionate share of new cases, have lower uptake. So our efforts so far, as a nation to roll out PrEP and PEP have not been as effective, and have not really targeted that community effectively. And so there are so many more people who need these interventions. These numbers need to go up in order to really work on curbing the current epidemic. Next slide. So just a bit about HIV prevention, pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis, just for those who may not be super familiar with it. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is when an HIV negative person who has risk for becoming infected with HIV takes a pill every day. We'll also talk about an injectable option on the next slide, but then it prevents HIV infection. Post-exposure prophylaxis is when we use multiple drugs taken together for 4 weeks to prevent turning HIV positive after a potential high-risk exposure. So it's really most effective if started within the first 2 hours after exposure, but can be all the way up to 72 hours after exposure. Next slide. Long-acting injectable PrEP. This is a great new intervention. Some of the benefits of this, now being FDA approved, is that it doesn't require daily dosing. It's highly effective at preventing HIV, and it's essentially directly observed therapy. So these are deep IM injections, which is a drawback. Obviously, that is painful. It has to be done every 2 months. So patients have to go in every 2 months and get this injection, and timing is important. It's also expensive, so it's resource intensive, because along those lines being expensive, we have to spend time getting approved from insurances, accessing patient assistance programs from the manufacturer, and it requires a decent amount of sort of case management, patient navigation resources, but incredible for patients who maybe have issues with adherence, patients who are unstably housed, don't have a place to store their medications, don't always, have other comorbidities, whether they be mental health comorbidities, substance abuse comorbidities. Next slide. So just really want to more than anything make a case for comprehensive care. The LGBTQ service landscape has historically been really, really fragmented. Services have been in all different places. You go one place for hormone therapy, you go one place for HIV treatment, or one place for primary care, and one place when you've got a cold, right? If we can create medical homes, where we co-house services and find a way to keep patients engaged in care, we can, minimize the effects of or the struggles with navigation of the system. Bundling those services really helps to keep patients engaged in care. I think one model we've seen a lot of is adding in gender affirming care with HIV treatment as one way to make sure that patients are returning for care and keeping them, with multiple services in the same place. It really minimizes patient and provider frustrations when we're all working closely together as a interdisciplinary team, and then it increases the quality of care and optimizes our use of limited resources so we can get the most bang for our buck. Next slide. So, what we've learned so far in building this program is that, LGBTQ affirming care, affirming providers are not really enough. It has to be a team effort. So we need an interdisciplinary effort to create an affirming healthcare environment. We have to think about things like staff, cultural competence, so the front door staff, the medical assistant, scheduling everybody that someone comes into contact with. It's not just the providers. The physical environment itself, so having gender neutral restrooms, affirming signage, a place where people can feel comfortable when they come so that they are motivated to come back and continue to seek those services. Looking at our computer systems, our billing systems are really important. Having a way to clearly denote the patient's name, the pronouns, things like that, so that they can be addressed respectfully. And then our clinical workflow, so looking at how we work with the lab, and then things like I mentioned before about informed consent protocols, how we get things going, how we get someone up and going on a treatment that they may need. And then this is just an information slide. My contact information is there. I'm always very happy to be a resource for anyone. Please feel free to reach out through our email address. You can call or text the number. We do have appointments available within the next couple of weeks. And you can also follow me on Instagram if you like to. Try to share some resources there when I have the opportunity. Thank you so much for your attention, and look forward to hopefully squeezing in a few questions or a little bit of chat with everybody.
So
Thank you,
I,
Dr. Hunt.
Aman, could I chat?
Sure.
I just want to say, wow, with the explanation point that for the past hour and 15 minutes that I have just been engaged and riveted, and probably I'm usually easily distracted, but I have been completely engaged. And thank you to Sylvester, Kevin, and Dr. Awad. You guys knocked it out of the park, and I can't wait to have the three of you do this again in the fall. That's it for me. That's it for me. And thank you, Aman, for being an amazing moderator.
Thank you. I just need to compliment your ability to cover that much information in the time that you did. That was very, very impressive. We have just one question, and I think in the interest of time, we probably should not, ask for more unless someone has a question they really want to get in. Feel free to send it in the chat and we'll respond via email. This question was received during your presentation, Sylvester. What do you think the addiction treatment field needs to work on to improve things for the LGBTQ community?
So for that is just to understand just the general trends and what people are using, creating more of an open stance in terms of people who are affirming. I think one of the things that I've come across are people who kind of step back. I think Dr. Awad mentioned that there is a sense of hesitation, but there shouldn't be. And I don't mean to moralize this, but we all have the ethical mandate to be competent in this area. Also, we need to understand the unique risk factors that people in the LGBT community face in terms of, homelessness, different types of stressors, communicable diseases, isolation, and things of that nature. Anything that feeds into the functional patterns of use are really important to understand and examine. And then, Kevin mentioned this too, which is, what are the support networks? It was mentioned that historically people in the LGBT community, their places for gathering were associated with alcohol use, were associated with illicit drug use. How do we create safe spaces that are rewarding, that kind of foster that sense of community without, the substances being present too? And one of the things that I researched in completing my slides was, we do see best outcomes when we integrate information relevant to the LGBT community in all of the groups that we do, right? It doesn't make it an LGBT group per se, but it may pique someone's interest to know that you are speaking to them, even though they are not openly identifying as such. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and if I may, I just want to also include that for everyone here working in the substance use field or not, the biggest thing is to just be supportive and be an ally. You don't have to assume, you don't have to, even like sometimes I feel people are so cautious about what to say and not saying the right thing or the wrong thing or whatever it may be. And it's okay to say like, I don't know, can you teach me? Or can you help me understand? Or even share, what you might be struggling with, because the other person will not be able to have that conversation with you and share their experience and how they feel without knowing how you feel or that you're open to that conversation. So being an ally is so easy, and anyone who is working with our population, whether substance use or any other behavioral health area, just being respectful and being open to learning about the individual who you're working with and not making assumptions. Michael, I know you really have been trying to share your slides the whole presentation, but we're not going to be able to do that. So again, if you guys have questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat right before we end this. But I want to thank Sylvester, Kevin, and Dr. Awad so much for being available for today's panel and for the information that you provided. And we look forward to collaborating with you again and working, to send our clients back and forth wherever they may benefit from best. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.